In the quiet corners of northern Italy during the late 1970s, whispers began to spread. Whispers about strange attacks, random fires, and killings so brutal they seemed ritualistic. At first, no one could connect the dots. A homeless man burned alive inside a park. A group of people slaughtered outside a nightclub. A psychiatric patient stabbed without reason. The police searched for answers, but found only chaos. These crimes didn't look like the work of mafia families, nor the outbursts of petty criminals. They seemed ideological, almost theatrical, like someone was trying to make a point through murder. What kind of point? And why were the victims always the vulnerable, the weak, the outcasts of society? For years, the killers hid in plain sight. They were not shadowy strangers from the underworld. No, they were two young men from respectable families, educated, polite, even charming. But behind their well-groomed appearance lay a chilling obsession with violence, purity, and the twisted echoes of Nazi ideology. Their names were Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan. Together, they formed a pact of blood, a pact that would claim the lives of dozens and leave an entire country gripped by fear. Tonight, on Sleeping Radio, we'll uncover their story from their privileged beginnings to the nightmarish killings that made them infamous, all the way to their shocking downfall. So settle in. Let your mind drift into the darkness of this tale, and prepare to wonder, how could two ordinary young men turn into monsters who believed they were cleansing society? And how did their thirst for violence finally lead them to ruin? In the city of Verona, known worldwide for Shakespeare's tale of Romeo and Juliet, life in the 1960s and 1970s seemed calm, almost romantic. Verona was a place of cobbled streets, grand churches, and riverside cafes, a place where young men could dream of careers, travel, and opportunity. To most outsiders, it was a city far removed from the shadows of violence. It was here that two boys, born only a year apart, grew up side by side. Their names were Wolfgang Abel, born in 1959, and Marco Furlan, born in 1960. Both came from middle-class, respectable families. They were not raised in poverty, nor in broken homes. Their parents provided for them, gave them education, and saw them as ordinary children destined for promising futures. Wolfgang was the quieter of the two, tall and somewhat reserved, with a seriousness that set him apart even as a child. Marco, on the other hand, was livelier, quick to laugh, and always seeking excitement. Together they balanced one another. To their teachers and neighbors, they looked like any pair of bright Italian boys, walking to school, attending church with their families, and talking about football matches and the latest music. But beneath this surface of normalcy, a darker fascination began to grow. The post-war decades in Europe were complicated. Italy, in particular, was a land haunted by the memory of fascism and Mussolini, a country that had lived through dictatorship and war. By the 1970s, young people were being pulled in many directions. radical left-wing movements, anarchist groups, far-right organizations, and a general wave of political extremism that shook the nation. For Wolfgang and Marco, it was the symbols of fascism and Nazism that caught their attention. At first, perhaps, it was nothing more than the rebellious thrill of looking at things forbidden. Old swastikas, Hitler's speeches whispered about in secret, or pamphlets shared among extremist youth groups. But as the years passed, that thrill hardened into an ideology. They began to read about racial purity, about the Nazi obsession with cleansing society of the weak. To them, these were not distant, dusty ideas. They became a lens through which they judged the people around them. The homeless man on the street, the drug addict, the mentally ill patient, even the gay man living quietly in the neighborhood. All became, in their twisted imagination, unworthy of life. Still, to their families, nothing seemed wrong. Wolfgang enrolled in studies. Marco appeared to be preparing for a respectable career. They smiled at relatives, celebrated birthdays, and enjoyed the freedoms of youth. Behind closed doors, however, their conversations grew darker. They began to form a private language of hate. Together, they fed one another's fantasies. It was no longer enough to admire symbols or whisper slogans. They wanted action. They wanted to bring these ideas to life. And so, the seeds of violence were planted. By the late 1970s, Italy was experiencing what would later be called the Years of Lead, a time of bombings, assassinations, and terrorism from both the far left and the far right. To the authorities, Wolfgang and Marco were just two more young men living in a tense era. To themselves, they were destined to rise above the ordinary, to become warriors of a cause. Their first discussions about killing were almost surreal. Sitting in quiet cafes, or walking late at night through Verona's silent streets, they asked each other, "What if we could do something bigger? What if we could strike against those who weaken society?" At first, it might have been talk, the kind of reckless talk young men often entertain. But unlike others, Wolfgang and Marco kept pushing the line further. Their sense of morality began to wither. Killing did not sound unthinkable anymore. It sounded possible. In these formative years, they built their partnership. A partnership that would later terrify Italy. Abel was the planner, calm and methodical. Furlan was the executor, impulsive and bold. Together, they believed they could carry out acts that would go unnoticed at first, then later shake society to its core. It is chilling to consider how ordinary their beginnings were. Two boys from good families, two students with potential, two young men who, in another life, might have become doctors, teachers, or businessmen. Instead, they allowed obsession to consume them. Instead, they chose to walk a path that led not toward success, but toward darkness, death, and infamy. The city of Verona did not yet know what was coming. Families still strolled along the Adige River. Couples kissed under the balconies said to be Juliet's, and tourists marveled at the Roman amphitheater. But somewhere in that same city, Abel and Furlan were plotting. The days of innocence were over. Their story, one that would stretch across years, across borders, and across dozens of lives, was about to begin. The late 1970s in Italy were heavy with unease. Newspapers spoke of bombings in Bologna, kidnappings by the Red Brigades, and gun battles between extremists of every shade. For ordinary Italians, it felt like the country was unraveling, pulled between chaos and ideology. And yet, amid this turmoil, no one suspected that in Verona, two young men were crafting their own sinister project, a private campaign of death. Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan had grown restless. Reading and talking about Nazism was no longer enough. They wanted to act. They wanted to transform their fantasies into reality, to show the world that they were not just dreamers of violence, but executors of it. But how could two young men, still in their early 20s, cross the line from thought to murder? The answer lay in their friendship, or rather, in their pact. At some point, during long nights of drinking and dark conversation, they sealed an unspoken vow. They would become soldiers of an idea. Not soldiers in the uniform of a state, but soldiers of their own imagined purity, cleansing society of those they considered weak, useless, and corrupt. And so they began to plan. Their victims would not be chosen at random. They would be chosen according to a perverse logic. The homeless, the addicted, the marginalized, the people who had no voice, no defenders, no political power. If anyone questioned the killings, Abel and Furlan could justify them by claiming that these lives were already worthless. Their first experiments in violence were crude. In 1977, fires began to appear in Verona, set deliberately in places where the homeless slept. At first, authorities thought these were accidents, perhaps caused by discarded cigarettes or faulty stoves. But the pattern was too precise, too deliberate. Someone was hunting the weak. One night, a man who had lived on the streets for years was found burned to death inside a makeshift shelter. His name barely made the papers. A small headline, a brief note. Homeless man dies in fire. No one linked it to ideology. No one imagined it was the opening move in a campaign of murder. For Abel and Furlan, however, the thrill was intoxicating. They had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. They felt powerful, superior, almost untouchable. If killing a forgotten man brought no consequences, what would stop them from going further? By the early 1980s, their attacks grew bolder. They targeted patients at psychiatric hospitals, men and women who were already abandoned by society. In their twisted worldview, these people represented decay, lives unworthy of continuation. Armed with knives, clubs, and sometimes even makeshift explosives. They would strike in the dark, leaving behind scenes of horror. The cruelty of their methods revealed the depth of their obsession. Victims were not only killed but humiliated, their deaths staged in ways that echoed ritual. In some cases, Abel and Furlan left behind graffiti or symbols, crude references to Nazism, as if to declare their allegiance to a cause that had died decades earlier. Police began to notice the pattern, but the sheer randomness of the victims made the investigation difficult. How do you track killers who select the most invisible members of society? Those whose deaths barely make headlines. The authorities struggled to see a connection. Each crime seemed isolated, tragic, but not necessarily linked to a larger plot. And so Abel and Furlan continued. Their partnership deepened with each act. Wolfgang, cold and calculating, provided the ideological justification. Marco, impulsive and daring, delivered the blows. Together, they fed on one another's darkness. To outsiders, nothing seemed unusual. They still presented themselves as ordinary young men, the kind you might pass on the street without a second thought. Marco still laughed with friends. Wolfgang still carried himself with quiet seriousness. But behind the facade, they were intoxicated with the feeling of playing gods, deciding who lived and who died. As their body count grew, a name began to form in whispers among investigators: the Monsters of Verona. At first, it was nothing more than a grim label, a way to group together a few unexplained killings. But soon the label would stick, and Abel and Furlan would find themselves hunted as predators whose crimes could no longer be ignored. But in these early days they were invisible. Each murder gave them more confidence, more boldness, more hunger. Killing had become a rhythm, almost a habit. And in the shadows of Verona, two ordinary young men were becoming monsters in full. The pact they had sealed, a pact of blood and ideology, was now in motion. And Italy, though it did not yet know it, was about to face a nightmare that would span nearly a decade, leaving bodies across the country and even beyond its borders. By the early 1980s, whispers of strange, savage crimes began to echo beyond Verona. Italy was already a country scarred by political violence. But what Abel and Furlan unleashed was different. Their acts were not tied to organized terrorist groups, nor to ransom, nor to any clear political demand. Their killings were both chaotic and symbolic, designed less for gain and more for spectacle. The two men had discovered that anonymity was their greatest shield. When they targeted the weak, society looked away. When they struck in the shadows, police struggled to connect the dots. And so, emboldened, they expanded their hunting ground beyond Verona, carrying their twisted crusade to other Italian cities. One of their most notorious attacks came in 1983. That year, Abel and Furlan turned their attention to a nightclub in Castiglione delle Stiviere, near Mantua. Inside, young people danced under neon lights, oblivious to the danger creeping toward them. Abel and Furlan had prepared bottles filled with gasoline, crude Molotov cocktails. Their plan was simple: to unleash fire, chaos, and death. When the flames erupted, panic swept through the club. Screams cut through the music as fire devoured the dance floor. People scrambled for exits, some tripping, others trapped. In the chaos, 2 women lost their lives, burned alive in what should have been a night of joy. Dozens more were injured, scarred physically and emotionally. The brutality of this attack could no longer be hidden in the small corners of newspapers. Headlines screamed of neo-Nazi arsonists, of monsters targeting innocents. The murders were no longer limited to the homeless or the forgotten. Now, ordinary young Italians, people with families, friends, and futures, were victims too. For Abel and Furlan, the nightclub fire was a triumph. They believed they were sending a message. Society's pleasure, its nightlife, its decadence, was corrupt and deserved punishment. Their ideology was part puritanical rage, part Nazi obsession, and part raw sadism. Each attack was not just a killing, but a performance, a theatrical act of violence meant to terrify, and terrify it did. Across northern Italy, rumors spread of mysterious men striking without pattern. Fires, stabbings, beatings. The randomness made everyone uneasy. If the killers had a target list, it was invisible. Anyone could be next. The police were overwhelmed. Italy's law enforcement in the early 1980s was already battling mafia crime, political assassinations, and terrorism. The idea that 2 seemingly ordinary young men were carrying out ritualistic murders for ideological reasons seemed almost too bizarre to believe. Investigators were reluctant to link the crimes, hesitant to see a pattern in the chaos. And so, Abel and Furlan remained free. Their methods grew even more grotesque. Victims were sometimes burned alive. Others were beaten with iron bars. In one particularly chilling case, a psychiatric patient was stabbed repeatedly, left to die in his hospital bed. To Abel and Furlan, these people were useless eaters, echoing the horrific Nazi term used to justify the extermination of the disabled during the Holocaust. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as executioners of a twisted ideology. By 1984, the death toll was rising. Some accounts suggest they killed as many as 15 to 28 people during their spree. Others believe the real number may be even higher, hidden in the shadows of unsolved cases. But beyond the killings themselves, it was the sense of fear that spread. For the first time, Italians were asking, were these men terrorists, cult members, or simply psychopaths? The press struggled for labels. Some called them the monsters of Verona. Others began whispering about a new generation of Nazis rising in Europe. A frightening reminder that the ideology of hate had not vanished with the fall of Hitler. Meanwhile, Abel and Furlan lived double lives. To their families, they remained the same. Wolfgang, the serious young man with a polite demeanor, and Marco, the sociable, energetic companion. They could sit at a dinner table and smile while carrying, in their minds, the memory of fire and screams from the night before. The mask of normalcy protected them. The longer they escaped justice, the more invincible they felt. Each killing became easier, each act of violence more daring. And as their crimes crossed borders into Germany and Austria, it became clear that this was no local madness. It was a continental hunt. The authorities now faced a terrifying question. How do you catch killers who move like ghosts, who leave no demands, no warnings, no clear patterns? Only fire, blood, and death. Italy was on edge. And Abel and Furlan, intoxicated by their own sense of power, were far from finished. Their reign of terror was not yet at its peak. In fact, the worst, and the most shocking, was still to come. As the years passed, the violence of Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan became more than random cruelty. Their killings began to take on a darker, more symbolic form, as if each act was a message written in blood and fire. They were no longer satisfied with simply extinguishing lives. They wanted the world to notice, to recognize that behind the murders was an ideology, a twisted belief system drawn from the shadows of history. To understand this phase of their crimes, one must look at how Abel and Furlan saw themselves. They were not thieves. They did not kill for money or material gain. Nor were they motivated by personal revenge. Instead, they adopted the role of self-appointed executioners. Like fanatics of an ancient order, they believed they were purging society of what they called parasites. Their victims were the vulnerable: drug users, alcoholics, the homeless, patients in psychiatric wards, sex workers, and even members of the LGBTQ community. To the killers, these were not individuals with lives and stories, but symbols of a world they despised, and they made sure their killings carried that symbolism. Sometimes they left graffiti at the crime scenes, swastikas, neo-Nazi slogans, and words invoking purity and cleansing. Other times, their methods of murder mirrored the cruelty of Nazi camps: burning, beating, stabbing with ritualistic fury. These acts were not only about ending lives, but about staging a performance of ideological hatred. The arson attack on the nightclub in 1983 was a turning point. Until then, many of their victims were invisible to society, but the nightclub, filled with young, vibrant people enjoying music and dancing, symbolized for Abel and Furlan what they saw as the decay of modern life: indulgence, pleasure, weakness. By burning it, they wanted to send a message that their violence was not random. It was directed at the very core of what they considered a corrupt society. And yet, even as their killings grew bolder, their public identities remained untouched. Abel continued to live quietly, appearing as a thoughtful and serious young man. Furlan was still the energetic friend, full of laughter in social settings. They could sit across from relatives, politely eating dinner, while in their minds they replayed the screams of victims. Their ability to maintain this double life was part of what made their spree so terrifying. For investigators, the challenge was immense. Crimes that crossed regions, that involved fire in one case, stabbing in another, beating in yet another, they seemed disconnected. The victims belonged to different groups, lived in different cities, and had no obvious ties. Only when symbols and methods began to repeat did some detectives suspect a pattern. In truth, Abel and Furlan wanted that recognition. Their killings were designed not just to eliminate, but to terrify. Like terrorists, they craved notoriety. But unlike political groups of the time, they had no central manifesto, no spokesperson, no public demands. They were an invisible sect of two, communicating only through the horror they left behind. By 1984, whispers of neo-Nazi killers had spread through newspapers. The phrase, "monsters of Verona," began to circulate more widely, and the fear was no longer confined to the north. Families across Italy wondered who these men were and when they would strike again. Italy, still haunted by its fascist past, shuddered at the idea that two young men were reviving the ideology of hate in the most brutal way possible. Some accounts suggest that Abel and Furlan also traveled beyond Italy to commit killings in Germany and Austria, extending their reign of terror across borders. If true, it would mean that their crimes were not just an Italian tragedy, but part of a broader European nightmare. Wherever they went, they carried their signature. Violence mixed with ideology. Cruelty staged as performance. For the victims, there was no chance of understanding this twisted logic. A man sleeping on a park bench never imagined he was seen as a target by two strangers. A psychiatric patient in a hospital bed could not fight back against men who believed his life had no value. A woman out for an evening of dancing had no way of knowing she was stepping into a nightclub chosen for destruction. Each death was senseless, each act an insult to humanity. Yet, for Abel and Furlan, each killing reinforced their bond. With every victim, they felt closer to their imagined role as soldiers of purity. Their friendship, their pact of blood, became inseparable from their crimes. They were no longer just Wolfgang and Marco, two young men from Verona. They were, in their own eyes, warriors of an ideology, writing their story in fire and blood. But, as with all who live in shadows, their confidence was their undoing. The very theatricality of their killings, the messages they tried to leave behind, gave investigators clues. Slowly, the police began to piece together the pattern, to realize that these murders were not accidents, not isolated acts of madness. They were part of a campaign with two men at its center. Italy was waking up to the nightmare, and the walls were beginning to close in. By the mid-1980s, Abel and Furlan's killing spree had stretched on for nearly a decade. Bodies had piled up, fires had destroyed lives, and fear had rippled through northern Italy and beyond. For years, the killers had seemed untouchable, ghosts who struck and vanished into the night. But slowly, almost painfully slowly, the tide began to turn. Investigators, who had once dismissed the crimes as isolated tragedies, started to notice the threads connecting them. Fires set deliberately in public places. Victims who belonged to society's margins. Attacks carried out with cruel precision. And above all, the hints of ideology. The graffiti, the symbols, the whispered rumors of young men obsessed with Nazism. At first, there was resistance to the idea. Italy was already overwhelmed with political violence from organized extremist groups. To suggest that two individuals alone could be responsible for such a wave of killings seemed implausible. But the more the police studied the evidence, the clearer it became. There was a pattern, and it pointed to something far darker than random violence. Journalists, too, began digging. Reports emerged in newspapers about the monsters of Verona, about killers who struck in the name of fascism, who seemed to be cleansing society through blood. While investigators still lacked names, the public was starting to piece together a terrifying profile. The killers were educated, they were mobile, and they were merciless. Meanwhile, Abel and Furlan grew reckless. Years of escaping justice had given them a sense of invincibility. They believed they were smarter than the police, faster than the law, destined to continue their campaign indefinitely. This arrogance would prove to be their downfall. In 1984, they launched another brazen attack, this time at a hospital. A patient in a psychiatric ward was targeted and stabbed. The act shocked the community. Hospitals were supposed to be safe places, sanctuaries for the vulnerable. To strike there was to send a chilling message. Nowhere was safe. But this time, investigators took note of small details, the timing of the attack, the methods used, and even eyewitness accounts of two young men seen nearby. For the first time, the killers were not faceless. It was around this period that Abel and Furlan began experimenting with explosives. They crafted homemade devices, crude but deadly, and used them in attacks. In one instance, a bomb exploded in a public place, causing chaos and injuries. Though it did not kill as many as their fires had, it reinforced the fear that these men were escalating, becoming more unpredictable, more dangerous. For police, the pressure mounted. The Italian public demanded answers. Parents feared letting their children go out at night. Clubs, bars, and even hospitals increased security. The killers had succeeded in spreading terror, but they had also drawn too much attention. Detectives began circling in Verona, the city that seemed to be the heart of the killings. They interviewed friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Slowly, Abel and Furlan's names surfaced, not as obvious suspects at first, but as young men with curious interests, unusual obsessions. Teachers remembered their fixation with Nazi history. Friends recalled their strange conversations about purity and cleansing. One by one, the puzzle pieces began to fit. But even as suspicion grew, the killers continued their spree. Their confidence blinded them to the fact that the net was tightening. To them, police were clumsy, slow, incapable of matching their cunning. They believed their intellectual superiority would shield them forever. The truth, however, was that every act left a trace. Every fire, every stabbing, every explosion added to the evidence. By 1984, investigators were convinced that the killers were not just random arsonists, but ideological murderers, a new breed of terrorist operating outside the structure of any known group. And so, the hunt intensified. Surveillance increased. Undercover officers spread through Verona and neighboring cities. Investigators tracked movements, built profiles, and prepared to strike. Meanwhile, inside their private world, Abel and Furlan felt invulnerable. They fantasized about bigger acts, about expanding their crusade further across Europe. Perhaps more nightclubs, perhaps larger bombs. They dreamed of leaving behind a legacy that would place their names in history, not as criminals in their view, but as purifiers of society. But history was not on their side. For the first time in years, their footsteps were being followed. Their faces, once lost in the crowd, were beginning to emerge in the minds of investigators. Their double lives were starting to crack. The stage was set for confrontation. What Abel and Furlan did not know was that their arrogance had already written the final chapter of their spree. They had played gods for nearly a decade. But soon the law would catch up, and the hunters would become the hunted. For nearly a decade, Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan had hidden behind masks of normalcy, walking among their neighbors as polite, educated young men, while secretly waging a campaign of fire and blood. But by 1984, their reign was collapsing. The authorities, once blind to the pattern, were now circling. Every new crime added pressure. Every headline sharpened the demand for justice. The monsters of Verona were running out of shadows to hide in. The turning point came in the spring of 1984. Abel and Furlan, confident as ever, decided to strike again. This time they planned to use fire, the method that had thrilled them since their earliest attacks. Their target was another gathering place, a venue where ordinary people sought entertainment, unaware of the predators lurking nearby. But arrogance makes mistakes inevitable, and in this attack, mistakes finally betrayed them. Witnesses noticed two young men behaving suspiciously near the site of the attempted arson. Their faces were glimpsed, their movements hurried. For investigators already studying the pattern of killings, this was the moment of clarity they had been waiting for. The faceless shadows now had outlines. Police placed Abel and Furlan under surveillance. Slowly, carefully, they tracked their routines. The men who had once moved invisibly were now under watch, their every step weighed against the growing mountain of suspicion. And as the investigation deepened, the double lives of the killers began to unravel. Abel, once admired for his quiet seriousness, was revealed to be the cold planner behind dozens of murders. Furlan, once seen as energetic and sociable, was unmasked as the eager executioner, the one who carried out the cruelties with unrestrained violence. Together, they were not harmless young men, but the architects of a nightmare. In the summer of 1984, the law closed in. Police forces coordinated across regions, determined not to let these men slip away again. And finally, in August, the arrest came. It was not dramatic. No shootout. No chase through city streets. Instead, it was almost anticlimactic. The two men who had believed themselves invincible were taken quietly, surrounded by officers who had spent months piecing together their crimes. Families who had lived in fear for years now saw the faces of the men responsible. They were not dark figures from a distant underworld. They were not mafia hitmen or shadowy terrorists. They were two young men from respectable families, raised in Verona, who had chosen to turn their intellect and energy toward evil. In the days that followed, investigators combed through the evidence. Abel and Furlan, the self-styled soldiers of purity, were reduced to mere suspects in handcuffs, their arrogance replaced by stunned silence. The news exploded across Italy. Headlines blared. The monsters of Verona caught. Neo-Nazi killers arrested. What they uncovered was staggering. Fires linked across cities. Victims from different walks of life, all chosen for their vulnerability. Graffiti and symbols tying the killings to Nazi ideology. And the sheer scale. Dozens of murders, perhaps as many as 28, stretching across nearly a decade. In custody, Abel and Furlan revealed little. They were not remorseful. They did not break down or beg for forgiveness. Instead, they clung to their justifications, insisting that their victims were parasites, that society was stronger without them. Their words chilled even the most hardened detectives. It was one thing to arrest killers. It was another to hear them speak of their crimes as if they were a duty fulfilled. For the families of the victims, there was a mix of relief and horror. Relief that the killers had been caught, that the nightmare had an ending. Horror at the realization of how calculated the crimes had been, how deliberate the cruelty. These were not crimes of passion. They were acts of ideology, staged and executed with cold precision. As Abel and Furlan awaited trial, the press feasted on the story. Who were these young men? How had they fallen so far into darkness? What did it say about Italy, about Europe, that two educated men from good families could become obsessed with Nazi ideology decades after the fall of Hitler? The answers were not simple, but the evidence was undeniable. The monsters of Verona had been unmasked. Their pact of blood had been broken by handcuffs and prison walls. Still, one question lingered. Would justice be enough to contain the legacy of their crimes? Or would their story continue to haunt Italy, a reminder of how ideology, when twisted, can turn ordinary men into monsters? The trial would soon provide answers, but for now, the streets of Verona were quieter, as if the city itself exhaled in relief. The killers had been caught. The nightmare was over, or so it seemed. The arrest of Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan in 1984 marked the end of their decade-long spree. But in many ways, it was only the beginning of another story, the story of justice, of reckoning, and of how Italy would remember the two men who had come to be known as the monsters of Verona. When they were brought to trial in 1987, the courtroom was filled with a mix of curiosity, outrage, and grief. Families of victims gathered in silence, carrying with them photographs of loved ones who had been burned, stabbed, or beaten to death. Reporters crowded the hallways, their pens and cameras ready to capture every word. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How would Abel and Furlan explain themselves? The two defendants, now in their late 20s, did not appear as wild-eyed monsters. They looked composed, almost ordinary. Abel, with his serious demeanor, resembled a quiet student. Furlan, still carrying his energetic charm, smiled at times as though nothing were out of place. It was this ordinariness that unsettled many. How could men who looked so normal commit acts so brutal? Prosecutors laid out the evidence in grim detail. Fires deliberately set in places where the homeless slept. Explosives hidden in public spots. A nightclub turned into an inferno. Patients murdered in hospitals. The scale of the killings was staggering. Estimates of their victims ranged from at least 10 to as many as 28. Each crime was tied together by a chilling pattern. The obsession with purity, the deliberate choice of the weak, and the echoes of Nazi ideology. Witnesses testified to the strange behavior of the two men before their arrest. Teachers recalled their fascination with Hitler's writings. Friends remembered conversations where Abel and Furlan spoke of cleansing society. Survivors of their attacks, scarred for life, described the terror of escaping fire and explosions. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. This was not madness without reason, but ideology turned into ritualized violence. The defense tried to argue insanity. They suggested that Abel and Furlan were disturbed, that their obsession had clouded their judgment, that they could not be held fully responsible. But prosecutors countered with the cold precision of their crimes. These men were not out of control. They were deliberate, organized, calculating. They knew exactly what they were doing. In 1987, the verdict came. Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan were sentenced to life imprisonment. For many, it was a moment of relief. Justice, at last, had spoken. The monsters were caged. But the story did not end there. Over the years, the Italian justice system, with its complex layers of appeals and revisions, revisited their case. In the 1990s and 2000s, their sentences were reduced on appeal, adjusted under changes in sentencing laws. Eventually, both men were released from prison after serving decades behind bars. When news of their release spread, outrage erupted. How could men responsible for so many deaths walk free? How could society forgive what had been done? But the law had spoken again, and Abel and Furlan slipped quietly back into the world, their names forever stained, but their bodies free. For Italy, the case left scars. The crimes of Abel and Furlan forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. That ideology, even decades after the fall of fascism, could still inspire violence. That ordinary young men could carry darkness within them, and that society's most vulnerable could become targets of cruelty simply because they had no one to defend them. The legacy of the monsters of Verona is not measured only in numbers or headlines. It is measured in fear, in the lingering unease that for years haunted the streets of Verona, Mantua, and beyond. It is measured in the grief of families who never received closure, who never understood why their loved ones were chosen to die. And perhaps most haunting of all, it is measured in the ordinariness of the killers themselves. Abel and Furlan were not raised in violence. They were not born into war. They were young men with futures who could have lived quietly, who could have contributed to society. Instead, they chose a path of hate, obsession, and blood. Their story remains a cautionary tale. It reminds us that evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it smiles politely, shakes your hand, and walks beside you in the daylight. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for nightfall to reveal its true nature. And so, the tale of Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan comes to a close. From two ordinary boys in Verona to the feared monsters of Italy, their journey was not one of chance, but of choice. Choices that led them into darkness, choices that left dozens dead, and choices that still echo in history. Their crimes remind us how fragile the line between normal life and horror can be. How two men, given every opportunity, could reject it all for the cold embrace of ideology and violence. And how, in the end, even monsters who believe themselves untouchable are caught by time, by law, and by the weight of their own deeds. Thank you for joining us tonight on Sleeping Radio. If this story has left you wondering, if it has made you question the shadows that sometimes live behind ordinary faces, then its lesson remains alive. As always, stay safe, let your thoughts drift, and allow yourself to rest. Good night.